Rome did not begin its dominance in Latium by conquest alone, it began by presiding. In the early stages of Latium's political evolution, the Latin League was formed as a loose federation of independent towns, Aricia, Lanuvium, Tusculum, Lavinium, among others, united not by subordination, but by shared rights, kinship traditions, and mutual defense. It was a horizontal alliance, fragile but functional. Then came Rome. According to Mommsen, Rome's rise within this federation was less the result of force than of strategic positioning. Its kings, especially the later monarchs, took care to present Rome not as a conqueror, but as a protector of Latin unity. They hosted the League's councils, arbitrated its disputes, and increasingly positioned themselves as the keystone to its cohesion. Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, pushed this role further than any before him. He acted not as a delegate, but as the League's commander. The shift was subtle, but decisive. Rome was no longer one Latin town among many. It had become the seat of Latin authority. The League still convened, but it convened under Roman auspices. Its deliberations still occurred, but they unfolded in Rome's shadow. Mommsen underscores that this was a constitutional transformation cloaked in continuity. Rome did not dissolve the Latin League, it appropriated it. The Alban Mount, once a neutral ground for common religious worship, became the stage on which Roman authority was ceremonially reinforced. Roman commanders presided over the Latin festivals. Roman officials brokered treaties. Even the shared deities of Latium increasingly bore Roman interpretations. This shift was not without resistance. But the structure of the League, lacking centralized mechanisms of enforcement, was vulnerable to internal imbalance. Rome offered protection against the Volsci, arbitration in local disputes, and leadership in war. And for many Latin towns, this trade of autonomy for stability appeared preferable to disorder. What emerged, as Mommsen describes it, was not an empire in the modern sense, but a managed system of dependence, a political ecology in which Rome was the gravitational center. Leadership disguised as consensus, hegemony masked by ritual. Rome had not yet annexed Latium. It didn't need to. It had already assumed control of its voice. Rome's control of Latium was not enforced by garrisons or permanent occupation. It was secured through law and ritual. Mommsen emphasizes that the consolidation of Roman hegemony did not require the dismantling of Latin institutions. It required their synchronization. The Latin League, though nominally a collective of equals, began to function under a common legal framework increasingly shaped by Roman precedent. Treaties were still signed between cities, but the language, format, and terms bore the marks of Roman legal thinking. What Rome offered was not just protection, it was procedural legitimacy. Disputes settled through Roman arbitration became binding. Intermarriage agreements carried the force of Roman interpretation. Even commercial interactions were reframed within Roman contractual norms. The legal customs of Rome were not imposed, they were adopted because they worked. More powerful still was Rome's influence through religion. The cult of Jupiter Latiaris on the Alban Mount, shared by all the Latin communities, became a crucial tool of cohesion. The annual Latin festival, Feriae Latini, was once a symbol of communal parity. Under Rome, it became a ritual confirmation of its supremacy. The Roman magistrate presided. The Roman army stood guard. The sacrifices were communal, but the altar had a master. Religious centralization did what arms could not. It consecrated Rome's leadership. To disobey Rome was not merely to reject authority. It was to break sacred unity. Mommsen is clear. This was not superficial influence. Law and religion in ancient Latium were not auxiliary to power. They were its architecture. And Rome understood this deeply. By embedding itself in the spiritual and legal rhythms of Latin public life, it transformed hegemony into habit. The Latin cities still retained their names, their walls, their councils. But the rituals they practiced, the contracts they honored, the gods they invoked, they increasingly bore Roman forms. And over time, the difference between local law and Roman law became one of language, not of substance. This was a colonization not of territory, but of structure. Rome did not need to conquer what it could define. Roman dominance in Latium was never static. It moved, quietly, structurally, through the absorption of political communities. Mommsen emphasizes that conquest alone was not Rome's preferred mechanism of expansion. It was more effective to bind a city than to burn it. And the method was clear: integration without equality. Some Latin towns were granted limited citizenship, civitas sine suffragio, a legal status that allowed them to share in Rome's protection and economic network, but not in its political power. These communities could be drafted into the legions. They could trade under Roman law, but they could not vote in the assemblies. They had a stake in Rome's future, but no voice in shaping it. Others were converted into Latin colonies. Not plundered, not erased, but resettled. Rome would send a small body of Roman or Latin citizens to establish a colony under Roman law, while preserving elements of the original civic identity. These colonies served dual purposes. They extended Rome's reach, and they suppressed the independence of their host towns. A friendly population within a conquered space, a garrison disguised as settlement. The strategy was political engineering. Rome didn't erase borders, it redefined loyalties. Local elites were welcomed into Roman patronage networks. They were offered positions, favors, and, occasionally, citizenship. Their ambitions were redirected, not toward resistance, but toward accommodation. Mommsen is careful to note that this was not benevolence. It was control by gradation. Each town was slotted into a hierarchy, its rights tailored to its utility and its submission. There was no universal formula. Some cities received municipal privileges, others had their institutions dismantled. What mattered was compliance, and the ability of Rome to map its authority onto a region without extinguishing its local identities. In this way, the Roman state expanded without needing to reinvent itself. It absorbed not just territory, but administrative function. Every alliance, every colonial charter, every conditional citizenship, these were extensions of Rome's own civic logic, mirrored back through the municipalities it bound to itself. Rome did not ask its allies to become Roman. It asked them to become useful. And once they were, it decided how Roman they would be. Not every town accepted Rome's leadership in ritual or law. Some resisted. And when they did, the limits of consensus became clear. Mommsen explains that Rome's strategy of integration, though calculated, was not universal in its appeal. Cities like Aricia and Tusculum, long-standing members of the Latin League, occasionally bristled under Roman direction. Others, such as the Volsci and Equi, outsiders to the Latin identity but neighbors in geography, saw in Rome not a protector but a growing threat. These hostilities were not contained to border skirmishes. They unfolded as sustained campaigns, raids, counter-raids, sieges. Rome responded not just with arms, but with pattern. Every war was followed by terms. Every peace by a reassertion of structure. Rome did not merely win battles, it won precedents. Mommsen notes that the Roman military was not a tool of imperial ambition in the modern sense. It was a mechanism for enforcing order. Rome fought to stabilize its environment, not just to expand it. And in this context, warfare was not the opposite of diplomacy. It was its executor. Treaties with defeated cities were crafted with precision. Some were allowed to retain nominal independence. Others were bound by annual obligations, troop contributions, grain, taxes in kind. Still others lost autonomy outright. Their governance folded into the Roman legal order. The most effective wars were those that allowed Rome to appear as a restorer of balance rather than an aggressor. When towns sought Rome's help against common enemies, the Republic entered not as a conqueror, but as a guarantor. But the result was the same: loyalty, then dependence. Mommsen insists that resistance, in this period, was never just military, it was cultural. It was a refusal to adopt Roman time, Roman law, Roman structure. And in every campaign, Rome's objective was not just to defeat, but to reform, to bring its adversaries into a system they had previously refused. War, in this early phase of expansion, was not the failure of diplomacy. It was the final step in a graduated process of incorporation. What Rome could not bind with law, it bound by force, and then recoded as law. The fall of the Roman monarchy did not interrupt Rome's dominance in Latium. It redefined it. Mommsen is clear. The expulsion of the kings marked a political rupture within Rome, but not a break in Rome's external posture. The republic that followed inherited the mechanisms of control, the treaties, and the alliances built under royal rule, and it set about reinforcing them. The early consuls, elected magistrates with temporary and limited power, retained the same military imperium once held by the kings. They led armies, renewed treaties, and presided over the Latin League festivals. But now, the acts of domination were backed not by personal authority, but by institutional continuity. The Republic did not soften Rome's grip, it stabilized it. Where royal policy had at times been ambitious and irregular, Republican governance provided predictability. Each year, the consuls were bound to follow legal precedent, religious calendar, and senatorial direction. Rome's expansion in Latium became procedural, routinized, and increasingly bureaucratic. Mommsen notes that the Republic was especially effective at preserving Rome's leadership role within the Latin League. The annual sacrifices at the Alban Mount continued. The Roman magistrate remained the president of the League's rituals, and the Latin allies, though nominally autonomous, increasingly deferred to Rome in military matters. Perhaps more significantly, the plebeian reforms within Rome itself, such as the tribunate and popular assemblies, had little immediate impact on Rome's conduct in Latium. The Republic may have broadened participation within the city, but outside it, power remained strictly hierarchical. What emerges, according to Mommsen, is a republic that did not democratize foreign policy, it professionalized it. Rome under the Republic became more consistent in its treatment of allies and subjects. It replaced the variable temperament of kings with the cold certainty of law. And so, the Republic proved not a break from the hegemony Rome had begun to build under the monarchy, but its natural continuation. The structures were the same. The aims were the same. Only the names had changed. Rome's expansion in Latium was not only mapped by armies and law, it was woven into the private lives of its elites. Mommsen highlights a subtler, often overlooked instrument of Roman influence: intermarriage. Strategic unions between Roman patrician families and the nobility of allied or subordinate Latin towns created a web of obligations and loyalties that extended Roman influence beyond the battlefield and the courtroom. These marriages were not romantic alliances, they were political instruments. They bound municipal elites to Roman houses, turning potential rivals into kin and weaving local ambition into Rome's own aristocratic fabric. A Latin noble who married into a Roman lineage no longer stood in opposition to Rome's authority. He was now invested in it. The legal implications were just as significant as the familial. Intermarriage often brought with it connubium, the right to form a lawful marriage with full legal consequences under Roman law. This conferred status. It opened pathways to partial or eventual citizenship. It served as an informal contract, loyalty in exchange for recognition. Through these unions, Roman customs, language, and religious practice spread into the domestic and ceremonial life of Latin households. Mommsen notes that cultural assimilation often preceded political incorporation. The Latin elite learned Roman law at the family table, Roman ritual at the altar, Roman politics through in-laws. The influence flowed one way. Rome absorbed little, it projected much. This quiet cultural exchange, enforced not by decree but by expectation, smoothed the path of Romanization. Towns that shared Rome's names, gods, family ties, and legal institutions were far less likely to resist its authority. They became reflections of Rome before they ever became its formal subjects. And so, without annexation, without revolution, Rome's world grew, not only by conquest, but by contract, not only by law, but by lineage. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, Our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.